Hello there, I'm K-Ball, and welcome to Human Skills, where I interview tech industry leaders about all the non technical skills that go into success in the tech industry. David J. has built a career at the intersection of technology and social movements. He studies relationships, how they form, what impact they have on organizations and movements, and how to set up conditions to better foster their growth. In this interview, we talk about this intersection point, looking at how to build relationships from a single topic focused interaction, how those relationships can develop into coalitions to get work done inside of organizations, and how to design events and their after spaces to best foster this type of relationship building. Please enjoy this interview with David J. David, welcome to the show.
So great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, you bet. So I thought maybe we could start with a little bit of your background, how you got interested in relationships as a thing that, really has informed a lot of your thinking and really your place at that junction of organizing and technology.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's been I think my whole life has been playing at this intersection of organizing. By organizing, I mean community organizing. I've done a lot of work building social movements. I've also worked as a software developer, um, and worked for Mozilla, worked for Samsung's Innovation Lab, or Mozilla Project, and worked doing movement building within tech companies. So I used to be the chief mobilization officer at a place called the Center for Humane Technology, where I was helping tech workers come together around the issues they cared about. And I'll get to that in a second. But um, I, what I'll say is that my experience is that in tech, almost more than a lot of places, organizing is how things get done. When I talk to people inside of Meta, when I talk to people inside of TikTok, there's often a lot of teams. It's often really murky around them. People are working on their product, but if they know how to bring people together across the organization, often outside of the official org chart, if an org chart even exists, then they can make things happen. So knowing how to see where relationships are possible and just gently invite those relationships in, can be hugely transformative. I know it's been really transformative for me, and I'll share more about that in a minute. But yeah, Uh, I got my start as a queer kid who just wanted to connect with other queer kids and who felt like the internet was the place to do that. Um, I identify as asexual. I spent all of high school really struggling with that, trying to feel okay with myself, never having talked to another person like me. And when I got to undergrad, I sort of had basic technical knowledge. And so I threw up a website and an online forum for other asexual people to find one another. And I that site wound up becoming the central gathering place for asexual people online. And I got to see how all of these people who had been struggling with the same things that I've been struggling with in isolation suddenly could find one another, suddenly could tell stories that there wasn't another place to tell, and feel seen in a way that they couldn't feel seen anywhere else. And how that led to these really rich relationships. And those relationships led to people suddenly getting things done, putting together magazines, advocating to change laws. We got delisted as a mental disorder. We, started influencing Hollywood and how asexual characters were portrayed. We were able to really do a lot with the relationships that got built out of that shared experience.
That's really cool. And that both the way that you're approaching that is like you had to think much more explicitly about what relationships were, and then you got to see it in action in these kind of relationships forming online out of nowhere.
Yeah, and it was interesting because uh, on the one hand, I was seeing this movement come together. I was seeing these people form relationships, and also relationships were a lot of what we were talking about. So, and I'll bring this back to kind of life inside of a tech company in a second. But um, as an asexual person, I was told that my relationships wouldn't really matter. That because I wasn't dating people in a traditional way, I was kind of destined to be alone forever. That all the people around me were going to pair up and go off and have their families, and I was going to be alone. And I didn't want that. I knew deep down that I had this really big need for human connection and this big need for intimacy, like I think the vast majority of people out there. And I wanted to form relationships that people took seriously, but I knew that the script of dating wasn't going to be how I did that. So I had me and a bunch of other asexual people, now ace people. That's a broader umbrella term. Me and a bunch of other ace people started asking a lot of questions about what relationships are, what intimacy is, how we build it, and how we intentionally go about the work of connecting with people if we're not kind of dating or professional networking, neither of which really felt like the things we wanted to do, um, or the things that served our need for human connection. Uh, and I came across a definition of relationship, which has been really clarifying for me, which is that a relationship exists wherever two people know how to spend time together. And when I first meet someone, we tend to know very little about how we might spend time together. Uh, but sometimes there's a little spark, a little thread of conversation that hints at something in both of our lives that is shared and powerful, and that hints at how we might spend time together in a way that adds something that we don't have another place to get. And if I can listen to that thread and follow it and respect the particular way of spending time that this relationship is about, then I can wind up with a bunch of different connections that are all about different things. I have friends that are about dancing. I have friends that are about deep intellectual exploration. I have friends that, where friendship's mostly about emotional support. I have friends where, now that I'm a parent, I have friends that are about parenting, helping people navigate their paths to parenting. And uh, and so the process of um, building relationships really became about um, listening to those little threads of potential, that there's a way to spend time with someone that could add something that I'm looking for, and then making space for them and exploring them. And I'll talk more about how that shows up. Uh,
Yeah, no, I really like that because it rings true in some ways to, I've talked with engineers about how do you build better cross-functional relationships. And for me, it usually starts with I'll invite somebody to either a real or virtual coffee,
mm-hmm.
and we'll sit together having a drink and we'll talk about what's interesting. And I have built relationships with people that started around books, that started around shared love of travel, that started around a shared interest in performance of different sorts. And but those relationships don't have to stay limited to that topic area.
No, it's like you sort of, it's, I think of it as this almost this evolutionary search function. Like you start there, and that gives you an excuse to spend time together, and then in that time you get to explore all kinds of other stuff. And so if the relationship is good, if the potential is good, you start at that one thing, and then you find another thing and another thing and another thing and another thing. And that's a sign that, like, okay, I should be making time for this person in my life. Um and I will often, when I'm reflecting, this is the thing I'll do sort of at New Year's or other times in my life. I will uh, journal about it. Like I'll sort of draw out or try to map what are what am I doing in the relationships in my life? Like what am I currently talking about? What are the how am I spending time with people in ways that feel good to me? And how am I looking to spend time with people? Like are there things I want to do in my life I don't have a relationship for yet? Um,
Mm-hmm.
and that's really helpful because as I go to different events, as I'm, sitting through meetings where I meet new people, as I'm like going and hanging out with friends of friends, if something comes up that like reminds me one of those things I'm looking for, I can know to stop and like focus on that, and maybe go to that person after the whatever event just happened and be like, "Hey, I really liked what you said. Do you have 5 minutes to talk right now?"
Mm-hmm.
And then that 5 minutes might lead to a coffee. And we're not starting that coffee conversation sort of cold guessing at what we might be interested in. We found a thread of what we might be interested in, and we're seeing where that leads us.
Yeah, well, I like that in the context of like you mentioned not just networking, but like professional networking, right? Professional networking is a challenge for
Mm-hmm.
most technical people. I feel like
Yes.
we all feel awkward and we're like, okay, I know I should go out and meet more people and that will be helpful the next time I'm needing to find a job or whatever. But like, I don't know what to do there. And I think you just gave us a recipe.
Yeah. And I, when I think, and I'm often thinking about this as an organizer, um, I'm thinking about like networking is sort of like it's got this very sort of binary graph. There's a sociologist who once said that um, we treat relationships like sticks, like two people holding a stick. And there's this image of professional networking that's like, I'm not holding enough sticks. I need to like walk into a room and exchange business cards and like be holding more sticks that go to other people. Um, and and that can feel really transactional and gross. And what I'm often thinking about is like, I think back to that experience as a young asexual person, because I found this working with tech workers and a lot is like, what are the things that I want to talk about that I don't have a place to talk about? And the place to go to find to be able to talk about them often is not a professional networking event. Like maybe it's just a question I'm holding, and when I go to a friend's party, I'm holding that question and like I raise it and I see if anyone's excited about it. Maybe it is like a meetup or a lecture or talk that's about that thing. um and then I stay for like little appetizers and whatnot afterward, even though it's socially awkward, because I know that the room of people who went to that talk are like probably going to be the people I get to talk to about this thing. They don't have another good place to talk about. But it's finding someone to explore a thing with that I know I want to explore, not like just finding someone to be a LinkedIn buddy with.
Totally. Okay, so how does this then play out inside of a company?
So when I was at the Center of Humane Technology, um, I started doing this trick where I would know people who are in integrity teams or trust and safety teams or responsible innovation teams, and I would have regular conversations. I become friends with them through the tools we just mentioned. Um, and I would say, uh, I'd say something like, "Tell me, what's top of mind for you? What are you trying to figure out? What like if you're inside of a company and you're dealing with any product challenge, uh, there's way more problem to deal with probably than you have the capacity. So like what are you looking to deal with?" And I would hear people who would say things like, here there are a range of challenges around youth mental health that we were trying to do something about, but our team is limited, or we have a really big election coming up and we're doing everything we can around this election, but we uh, but we're just isolating our team, and it kind of touches every part of the product service area. So we need people from across the company to be collaborating with us around how to prepare for this election. um, and I became really good at creating after spaces. So what I do, and this is a fake example because I don't want to give real examples, but it shows the tactic. What I do is, let's say it's an election that's coming up. I would find a handful of outside experts who knew a lot about the risk vectors related to that election. And they wouldn't necessarily be critical of the platform, but they would have a lot of really good information that product teams needed to know on the inside. And I would put together an event for people, for my allies on the inside, that would basically be like, look, here's some experts. They're going to tell you what they know, and then you can ask them questions. And they're going to ask 0 questions about the product, 0 questions about like anything that you would feel sensitive. At least seeing this as a information transfer from you to them. And that made it easier to manage NDAs and other things. So then the folks I was working with would go and they would like advertise on a bunch of Slack channels, and they would find everyone they could around the org who cared about elections, who maybe wasn't part of the election integrity team, but for whom this mattered personally, right? Like it was a thing they wanted to talk about, right? So the whole point of getting these people here, like there was value in getting the people to, getting the experts I had brought in to educate people, but the real value was getting everyone in a virtual room together, and getting people to see what are other people's questions about this. And so then I would transition from, and sometimes I do this in Zoom, sometimes I do this in other platforms like AirMeet, um, uh, but that have a little better affordances for this. Our transition from a usual audience question and answer format to getting people in the audience to talk with one another in small groups. And sometimes I would prompt them. Sometimes um, I would uh, let it be more loose. Sometimes I'd prompt them and then get it to be more loose. But my goal was I want as many people in this audience as possible to find one other person who said a thing that they're interested in. Like I want people to have a little flag that goes off that's like, oh, that like her over there, she seems cool. I want to talk to her. And then I want to give them a space where they're sort of free, where they can make those conversations happen, where they've got maybe just 15 minutes to like everyone who wants to talk to the person who you're most interested in talking to that you've heard say something in this presentation. And those liquid spaces afterward, when they happen well, are magic. Like I've seen so many things come out of uh, some really powerful like product features. New teams have been formed. Conferences have been seeded in those little spaces after the event, where people are just sort of like following up on the threads that have come out that are most valuable to them. So I'm often uh, when I'm in a room, when I'm in a meeting, I'm sort of like looking for who in the room kind of gets a little like highlight flag on them that's like, oh, that's someone I want to follow up and talk with. Um, and then ideally I don't have to arrange that time with them cold. I can like talk to them for a few minutes afterward to establish why it's worth taking the time to have a coffee. Um, but I'm often looking to design for that kind of like after space where people know who they want to talk to. And if I'm joining events and my goal is to form relationships, I'm looking for events that are structured to have that. So I'm looking around for events that not just like have a have food and drinks afterward, but do the work to let me and everyone else know who we should be excited to talk to in that time.
That is really interesting. And I feel like there's two threads we can go down here. There's the thread of I'm considering organizing an event like this. So say like I am on a trust and security team, or I'm on some other team where I have in my mind that I need some sort of large cross-functional initiative to happen. I don't have an outside organizer like you, David, to do it. Like, what should I do to set up that event? What are the key factors that are going to make it successful in creating this type of fluid after space that you're talking about?
Um, I often will, it's almost like I'm doing little tests with my event planning. And sometimes I'm doing tests by like floating a thing in Slack and seeing who's interested. Um, uh, but I am uh, finding a really interesting question around a topic and seeing if there's people who are hungry to talk about it. It's uh, uh, go. I'm listening for that feeling of like, oh wow, I like if there's a lot of people who want to talk about this thing and don't have a space to do it, then I know I'm onto something. And so I will usually that'll start with an experience that I've had where I see something that's missing that sort of should be there but isn't. I'll go and I'll just experimentally talk to people around me and see if that resonates with a few of my friends or other people I'm connected to. And if it does, then they sort of become allies to help put something together. Uh, and then I am uh, then I'll host events or I will go to events on related things and sort of raise this as a question. And I'm looking for like maybe 3 to 5 people who are from different parts of the organization or from different organizations, if this is a sort of professional network level cross organizational thing, like who come from different perspectives, all of whom share this idea that something should happen here. And if I can build that like cross intersecting alliance of people who are excited about it, then together we can make a lot happen, because I've got people who can share the work of organizing with me. I've got people who can advertise it to their respective domains, so more people come in. Um, and whenever I bring people together and connect them and create that after space, the thing that I'm looking for are people who I can sort of connect with and meet with and plug into that network of proactive leaders.
Okay. And then when you're designing the after space, what does that look like, either in a in-person environment or in a virtual environment? Like, what tactically do you do to make sure that people are able to find those, those flags that went up?
Yeah. And I realized that I just gave the last example with a lot of extraction, so I can give a more concrete example of that too. But I'll answer virtually, since that's where a lot of people are, and then I'll give an in-person example. So um, a virtual example, I had a lot of people who were excited about youth mental health. This was a public event, so it had some tech workers from large platforms, it had some tech workers from small platforms, it had some people who were, youth organizers, some people who were getting CS degrees and also were passionate about youth mental health. And I had them all convene in a platform called AirMeet, which I like sometimes a little bit better than Zoom. Basically, it lets me broadcast out for a while and then pause, and then there's a bunch of little virtual tables um, that all have kind of labels on them, and people can self-select into the tables they want. And uh, so I had a few youth leaders who were doing activism around youth mental health come and talk about the work that they were doing. Um, and this was an hour-long session. So I kind of introduced, I had people come and tell some powerful stories, so there's a shared sense of what the discussion about technology and youth mental health, like what it looked like from a youth leadership standpoint. I took a few questions from the audience, um, and then I gave the audience a prompt. I said, all right, in a second, we're going to break into tables. And I want you to just share a few words about why the intersection of youth mental health and technology matters to you. And don't take more than a minute, like make sure everyone can talk and then see where the thread takes you. And I broke up, I said there's a table for educators, there's a table for youth activists, there was a few different kinds of tables for tech workers, there was a table for startup founders, there was a table specifically for UX people. And I let people self-organize into their tables. And then I went from table to table, just checking in, hearing the stories they were telling, and helping to nudge the conversations in a good direction. And also listening for people who were especially passionate or especially well positioned, who I could have personally a follow-up conversation with. And um, uh, what happened was I got to see, like, some of the tables didn't really work out, but some of them started having really good conversations. And because there were 15 minutes left in the hour, people started having conversations that were really good. And when the formal end of the event happened, I got up and I made a little chat announcement, said, look, it's the end of the event. If you have to leave, you're welcome to, but if you want to stay, you're welcome to stay as long as you'd like. And probably 80% of the room left and 20% stayed. And some of that 20% stayed for 3 hours because they
Wow.
really were looking for a place to talk about this. And some of that 20% that left because they had work to do, but in that time at the end they'd found one or two people that they then had a follow-up conversation with, that later I learned had led to a whole relationship and a whole conversation happening. And so creating an after space that giving people enough of a shared sense of what to talk about, putting people with people who are likely to be people they'd want to form a relationship with. There was some cross-pollination between, like, the youth activists and the technologists that was important, and there were ways that I try to broker that. But for the most part, I was trying to connect, like, mid to senior level tech workers with other mid to senior level tech workers. And giving people a sense of who was in the room and a sense of how they connect with people before it was time for them to leave, so that they could decide whether or not they wanted to invest more time in talking.
Yeah, I love that. Now, we've just put in a whole bunch of work here to make these relationships happen. What is the outcome of all of this relational work?
I will answer that in three ways, because it's one of my, I don't know, hobbies, passions is studying complex relational systems, studying how using information theory and some other kind of agent-based modeling, nonlinear dynamics, to study what happens when relationships form. And there's sort of three things that happen. The first is that information flows throughout the system more powerfully. So if you imagine a place with a bunch of silos, those silos are breaking down. If you imagine a bunch of individual people who feel sort of like stuck in their corner, the people who are good at forming relationships feel less stuck in their corner. They know more about opportunities that are happening. They know more about they're sort of a source of new information to the people around them. And they just have a lot more options to move in. The second is resilience. So when there's a lot of relationships within a system, if something hard happens, then all of the relationships rally to fix it. So I'm part of a professional network called the Integrity Institute, which I recommend, if there's any integrity or trust and safety employees on the call, I recommend checking out. It is a professional network of integrity workers built around these sort of community organizing dynamics that does some really powerful work. And every once in a while, this just happened recently, someone like Meta will go and do a big wave of layoffs. And when that happens, a bunch of people come to the Integrity Institute community and they tell their stories and they say, hey, I was part of this roll of layoffs. And then they have a whole community of people who are helping them network to find another job. And so when communities exist, we see the same thing when there are a bunch of threats emerging because there's an election. Suddenly people can support one another across platforms in ways they couldn't before, in ways that are really, really powerful. So that sort of support and resilience is another key piece. And then the last is a form of kind of creative evolution, that the places where relationships happen, because they're places where things cross-pollinate, because they're places where people can support new ideas, tend to be the places where new and interesting things emerge. And if I've got a thing that I'm excited about, say it's related to a new way of classifying harms related to election integrity, and it's not a thing that I really have room to work on in my job, or I really have anyone in my immediate team who wants to support me around, but I've got a network of relationships, and some of those relationships exist because other people are excited about the same things I am, that I'm more likely to have a space where I get to kind of have support in an encouragement to tinker and create something new that may wind up being really, really powerful and really, really important. So relationships sort of make us more creative and kind of speed up the clock rate of evolution of the things we're working on.
I love that. Well, that speaks both to why leaders at a company might want to set up or do this type of work to foster ease of relationships, and why I as an individual benefit from being in more and richer relationships. Now, that's the other angle that we haven't talked about as much here yet. If, say, I'm an individual, I'm not an event organizer in whatever context that we're talking, whether it's within a company, maybe I'm a medium level IC or something like that. Like, I'm not likely to be going and organizing an event.
Yeah.
One, are there things I can do to help encourage this type of work to happen, even if I'm not the one who can run it? Maybe I can contribute, but I can't run it. Or two, how do I as an individual better kind of build relationships on my own or take advantage of these events as they happen?
Yeah, I'd say something I spend a lot of time doing just in my individual life and relationships, and this comes out of my what I was talking about my practice as an asexual person. So, um, as an asexual person, I do not experience attraction, sexual attraction. I'm not going to walk into a room and see people and think they're cute. And so I had a problem when I was younger where I'd walk into these rooms and I'd be like, everyone seems cool. Like, who should I be trying to form a relationship with? And if I didn't have that, didn't have a way to answer that question, I didn't have a way that some people in the room sort of stood out, then it was kind of difficult to know like who I should be going deep with. And that's an experience I've had. That's an experience I think a lot of people have had when you name sort of a networking, like a bad networking experience. It's often like walking into a room of completely undifferentiated people and you're like, I have no idea who I'd want to talk to or why. And so I just wind up having a lot of surface level conversations. um, and one of the things that I've found most powerful is spending time reflecting for myself, spending time talking to the people I'm already close to about what are the things that I know I want to explore and don't have a space to yet. And that's a really vulnerable question, right? Um, it's almost like what are the things I feel alone about in my life? And sometimes they're easy things to talk about, right? Like maybe someone is curious about the intersection of AI and something that no one's talking about yet, and the fact that no one's talking about it feels like a potential. But sometimes the things that we feel disconnected around are kind of vulnerable, and it takes a little bit of work to build up the confidence to be able to turn that vulnerability into curiosity, to say like, maybe the fact if I'm interested in it and no one's talking about it, that maybe that's not because there's something wrong with me. Maybe that's because there's a potential in the world that doesn't exist yet. And if I can sort of raise a little flag and say like, hey, no one's talking about this, but I think it's cool, then someone might see that flag and come to me. And so I think doing the internal work of building that confidence, and it doesn't have to be organizing an event. It could be as simple as just like making a comment out loud in front of a group and then seeing if anyone nods along and then following up with that person. But finding those things that you want a space to talk about and having the courage to kind of look for people who want to have that conversation with you.
I love that. Well, and it doesn't have to be unique, right? Like it could be, hey, we're all doing, I don't know, Python development. And I would like a group of people to talk about Python with more regularly outside of the context of our immediate problems.
Yeah. 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 It could be that. And like, you know, that's where meetups can be really good. That's where looking into different professional networks can be really good. What I found is that there are, because these networks can be so transformative, there are often people who are investing in building them. And sometimes they'll be in public places like Meetup, um, but often they will not publicly advertise because they sort of want people who are a little bit more skilled. If you make it available to anyone and you get a bunch of people early in their career showing up, then sometimes that'll dilute it. So for people who are maybe a little bit later in their career, asking around for networks of people can be sometimes more beneficial than doing it on Meetup or something. And sometimes it's like, people who care about Python development, and there's like a group of people who all are Python developers and they get together and play board games. But the fact that they're spending time together and learning to like and trust one another doing a fun activity creates the groundwork for all this other stuff. Um, so asking around about where there's some of those groups and gatherings happening can be really transformative.
Well, and I like your example there too, right? Which is board games is a great example because it's an event, but it doesn't have to be, I'm pulling in speakers and I'm finding all these different things. It's saying, hey, does anybody else want to play some board games?
Yeah. Yeah, and the dynamic there, it could just be like I have friends playing board games, but having if there's a thread that the people have in common, if it's Python developers playing board games, then all of a sudden I know that there's a topic of conversation outside of the board games that I can dive into that's going to be meaningful to everyone else in the room. And that adds a layer of relationality that otherwise wouldn't be there.
Yeah. Well, and I like what you're touching on there of thinking about ahead of time, what are the topics? Thinking about how you might bring those up, right? What is the doorknob that's going to open this thread of conversation? And it might be as simple as, "Hey, we're Python developers doing board games. Isn't that funny?"
Yeah.
Right? Like, okay, now we can talk about Python. Cool. Or we could talk about Settlers of Catan.
Yeah, we can make Python jokes about Settlers of Catan, and like people get them, and that's great. Yeah.
Exactly. How do you approach, so if you're starting from scratch and you're saying, gosh, I need something in my life.
Mm.
I don't know how to say it. I'm really awkward. How would I craft that statement that's going to put that out there in a way that somebody is going to not say, "Oh, you're a weirdo, go away," right? But is maybe going to attract the right people to say, "Hey, yeah, I'm interested in that too."
I think you're right to say that it's about starting with topics. Starting with things you're interested in, questions that are emerging, like questions that are up for you, and it could be questions related to technical stuff. It could be an activity that you want to try. But back to that idea that relationships are a way to spend time together. Don't start by saying, how do I get relationships? Start by saying, how do I want to spend time with other people? And if you have a sense of how you want to spend time with other people, that is way more approachable. If you show up and say, like, I want friends, that feels really awkward. Like, it feels really awkward to say, and it feels really awkward to receive. For awkward to receive the other person, because the other person's like, I don't know how to help you make friends. But if you say, hey, I've been wanting to try dancing, anyone know if there's any dancing stuff going on? Then like probably someone does, and probably that person would invite you along and be excited because the question of how you spend time together is answered.
I love that. Okay, cool. Let's maybe step back and look at a slightly different topic, which is this concept of relational work. I think we briefly touched on this as something that is, it is work, but it's also not necessarily valued in different organizations. How do you think about relational work as separated from other types of work? What makes it unique, and what makes it valuable?
That is a really good question, and one that I am thinking a lot about these days is, as an organizer, what I've noticed is that relationships tend to happen in particular times and places. I've talked a lot about the different kinds of events, the different kinds of gatherings that happen, and everyone needs to put some amount of work into making that happen. The people who have decided that this is the kind of event they want to go to, and then like taking the time to discover it and like get out of bed and go there, like that's work. Right? But there's a whole other kind of work that the people organizing the event do, the people advertising the events, the people sort of managing logistics, and some of that is like the work of setting up chairs and getting snacks and confirming speakers, but a lot of that is this work of figuring out what people want to talk about but don't have a space to talk about. A lot of that is the sort of facilitation work of understanding how to invite people who are going to be a good mix together. And then when you're in the room, like going around and cross-pollinating and being like, oh, you should really talk to this person about this thing. And maybe that conversation becomes a thread that becomes a whole relationship. So there's a particular kind of work that is about mapping our relational context and then seeing where there is potential for relationship and inviting it in. And that work, I think, is really, really critical, for all the reasons we've talked about. Like, unless there are new relationships happening, unless the relationships being maintained and built, then a lot of other things don't happen. And it's work that I believe is really difficult to automate. So if you look at a sociologist named Robin Dunbar, He was not a sociologist, but um, he was looking at why humans have really big brains. And he found that brain size in mammals is directly correlated to group size. So if you've heard of Dunbar's number, this idea that people can have 150 friends, we can sort of track a network of 150 people all in relationship with one another at one time. And that implies that the reason we have big brains is to reason about relationships around us. We've evolved these very expensive neocortexes because we it's really important and also really hard to do relational work, to understand where potential relationships are around us and do work to invite them in. And that means that that kind of work it's a really difficult thing to automate. It's a really difficult thing for AI to do. It's a really difficult thing to sort of build systems around. You kind of need a human who understands the context of relationships going on in order to do the work it takes to make relationships happen. So all that is to say, I think if we want to grow relationships, we need to do relational work. That work is really difficult to automate. It requires someone who understands local context, and often those people who understand local context, who understand how to make relationships happen, the value of their work isn't being seen, and that's a problem.
So this work of building relationships, providing space for building relationships, all this is clearly extremely important, but also often undervalued. Like, what do you have to tell the folks who are doing this work already?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting history, and one that I've seen play out in the tech companies I work with, um, which is that relationships are so immensely powerful for all the reasons we talked about. Um, they're also really hard to measure. One of the things I found working with different relational systems is that uh, relationships are highly nonlinear. You can predict the conditions that will lead to relationship, but you cannot predict where a relationship will lead. That means that if there's a KPI, there's some indicator that it's your job to make this number go up. Often, relationships are not a straightforward way to make one particular number go up. Relationships make a lot of stuff happen, but they make a lot of kind of good, aligned, unexpected stuff happen. They don't make one particular thing happen really, really efficiently most of the time. So if you're investing in relationships, you're sort of kind of planting a forest. You're not factory farming. And that means that in organizations that are really focused on efficiency, they're really focused on goals, which means they're focused on optimizing for predictable outcomes. Relationships kind of become invisible because they're so unpredictable, because they necessarily sort of become really diverse and not focused, not optimized around one thing. And if you try to make relationships only do one thing that's predefined, then they stop being any fun and no one wants to be in them anymore. They start feeling transactional and gross. And so often the people who are doing relational work get accused of quote unquote not doing real work because it's not optimizing for a predefined outcome, even if it is a necessary part of making the organization work. And for this reason, I've noticed that often relational work is missed when it doesn't happen, but not valued when it does. There's a really long history of relational work sort of being expected of women, being expected of queer people, being expected of folks of color, being expected of disabled people, where if folks do that work, it's just seen as invisible. But if they don't do the work, it's seen as their problem. And I think that's something to push back on. That's something that in the work that I'm doing, I'm trying to push back on, to be able to find ways to show where relationships are happening, to help people understand the impact of where relationships are happening, understand the work that it takes to make those relationships happen, because otherwise I think we wind up missing some of the most important work that's going on inside of organizations.
Yeah. think that's totally true. Another thing I've seen there sometimes is uh, relational work is expected of more senior folks,
Mhm.
but more junior folks who engage in more relational work, it gets discounted,
Yeah.
right? So beyond some point, relational work is a part of your job. Below some point, if you're doing it, wait, are you really working?
Yeah, and I've also been in circumstances where I was a junior person and I got really good at doing relational work, and it threatened the people above me, but they didn't know why. Where I was like, I can bring people together and just get things done. Like, I don't need resources and authority from my boss because like me and my five friends can just start exploring a thing. Um, and sometimes that was encouraged, and sometimes they were like, wait, but how do we control what you group of five friends are doing? Um, and so it can, I think, it also disrupts traditional hierarchy in ways that can be healthy and good, and in ways that can be complicated.
Say that you're someone who has not previously thought about relational work, but you
Hmm.
want to get started. What would you do as the first kind of one, two, three steps towards teaching yourself how to do this stuff?
There are, um, it's I'd say the way that I've learned it the most in my life is through mentorship. I look in the communities around me, and I look for people. When I go looking for relationships, who are the people who are making that possible, creating the places where that's possible? Who are the people who are doing that in the ways that I want to do that? And then I ask them for coffee. And like I sometimes become a person who's helping them, and I become a person who's learning from them, and they see potential in me and invest in me. And I'd say that kind of mentorship is something that has taught me a lot more than any sort of formal classes or textbooks. If there's skills to study, um, I would study the skill of group facilitation, and there's a lot of good trainings out there uh, that teaches a lot about how to bring people together and facilitate conversation, uh, and what to pay attention to in conversations to help to nudge them in the right direction. Uh, if if there were books to read, and again, sort of with mentorship as the most powerful, two, I think, kind of approachable books that I like on this are, the first is Emergent Strategy by Adrienne Maree Brown, which talks a lot about the structure of movements, but in a way that centers relationship formation, and I think has a lot of good inspiration for how to do this work. Um, the second is The Art of Gathering by Priya Parker, which talks specifically about how to design events, if that's a thing that people want to do.
Amazing. Well, David, this has been great. I've learned a ton from it. Is there anything that we haven't talked about today that you want to make sure you share?
Uh, if people are interested in my work, feel free to check out relationalitylab.org, where I'm asking a lot of these questions about how to build relationship in the context of social movements, um, and exploring how to know where relationships are happening. Um, and other than that, I really encourage people to think about the connections that you're building, think about the uh, the relationships you're building as this way that you're investing in change and resilience in your life and in the world around you. Because building the right relationships uh, is an incredible way to invite transformation into the world. And I know that's what a lot of folks that I know in tech on some level are working to do.
All right, that's it for this Human Skills interview. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking this video and subscribing to this channel. You can also subscribe to the Human Skills newsletter, which there's a link to right down below, to get notified of interviews like this as they come out. Take care, y'all. This is K-Ball signing out.